My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 30 years old. 3 weeks ago, my mother called a family meeting to divide my late grandmother's estate. 12 people. One long mahogany table. A lawyer she'd hired sitting in the corner, quiet like the outcome had already been signed and notarized before any of us walked in. And in the middle of that meeting, I placed my phone face up on the table, right in the center next to the papers they wanted me to sign. And I pressed play on 3 years of their own words. The only sound in that room was my aunt setting down her coffee cup, that small ceramic clink. 12 people who had spent years talking about me behind my back, and not one of them could look at the screen lighting up in front of them. Because what they had forgotten, what none of them had ever bothered to check, was that they never removed me from the family chat. They were so sure I was gone. So sure I'd stopped listening years ago that I'd drifted off somewhere and stopped mattering. That they used it the same chat to plan every single thing. Right in front of me. For 3 years. They thought they were talking behind my back. They didn't know they were just recording the evidence. 3 years. I didn't miss a single word. Every insult, every plan, every quiet little arrangement to cut me out of a family I was born into. I read all of it alone in the dark night after night, and I never typed a word back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I take you back to the beginning, take a second to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And do me one small favor while you're here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one of them. It reminds me I'm not alone in this, and something tells me some of you aren't either. Because to understand why I stayed silent for 3 years, why I let them keep talking when I could have blown it all up in a single message, I have to take you back to the one person in my entire family who ever actually saw me. And to the day I lost her. Let me tell you about the Bennett family. We lived in a white clapboard colonial in a town where everyone's last name was on a plaque somewhere. A church committee, a hospital wing, a little brass rectangle on a park bench. The kind of town where your reputation wasn't something you simply had. It was something you maintained carefully like a lawn. You trimmed it. You watered it. You made very sure the neighbors saw it looking green. My mother Diane maintained ours beautifully. There were 2 daughters in that house. My younger sister Vanessa was the one they photographed. Homecoming, graduation, the engagement party with the string quartet. If there was a frame anywhere in that house, Vanessa's face was inside it, smiling that easy golden smile that made adults lean in and say, "Isn't she just lovely?" And then there was me. I was the practical one. That was the word they used. Practical. It sounds like a compliment, doesn't it, until you've heard it enough times to understand what it really means. Practical is what people call the daughter they don't know how to brag about. It's the word you reach for when there's nothing shiny to point at. She's not gifted, she's not beautiful, she's not going places, she's practical. She'll be fine. Here's the thing about being the overlooked child. It doesn't happen in one big dramatic moment you can point to later. Nobody hits you. Nobody screams. It happens in 1,000 tiny moments so small that if you ever tried to complain about a single one out loud, you'd sound insane. It's the accumulation that breaks you. 1 drop of water is nothing. But 1,000 drops falling in the exact same spot for 20 years will wear a hole straight through stone. When Vanessa got into her sorority, my mother framed the acceptance letter and hung it in the front hallway where every guest would see it. When I paid off my student loans at 26, every last cent of it alone without a dollar of help from anyone. My mother tilted her head and asked me if I'd finally found something stable. Finally. As if my whole life up to that point had been a worry she'd been patiently waiting to end. I'll give you one more because I think it's the one that explains all the rest of them. When I was 10 years old, I won a regional writing competition. A real 100s of kids from all over the county, and I took first place. I was so proud I could barely hold it in. I remember running into the house with the certificate in both hands, and my mother was on the phone in the kitchen, and I stood there in the doorway holding it up, waiting. She covered the receiver with her hand. She looked at the certificate, and she said, "That's lovely. Now go wash up. Vanessa has a recital tonight, and we can't be late." And she went back to her phone call. That night, we all drove to my sister's dance recital, where Vanessa was one of 9 girls in the back row of a number about butterflies, and my mother cried and took photographs and told everyone within earshot how gifted her daughter was. And the certificate with my name on it sat on the kitchen counter next to the mail, and by the end of the week somebody had spilled coffee on it, and it went into the trash and no one ever mentioned it again. I didn't cry about it. I want you to understand that. I'd already learned by 10 that crying about these things only ever made them worse because then you were difficult on top of everything else. So I just quietly understood something new about my place in that house and I filed it away the way I was learning to file everything away. I wasn't the black sheep of that family. That's the part people get wrong when I tell them this. The black sheep gets noticed. The black sheep gets talked about, argued with, worried over. There's a strange kind of love in being the problem. I wasn't the black sheep. I was the beige one. I remember one dinner in particular. I'd just gotten a promotion, a real one, the kind that comes with a new title and a new office and a raise big enough to change your whole month. And I mentioned it quietly somewhere between the roast and the potatoes because some small hopeful part of me still thought maybe this time. My mother didn't even look up from her plate. She said, "That's nice, dear." And then in the same breath, without a pause, without a comma, she turned to my sister and said, "Vanessa, tell everyone what Derek's firm is doing for the wedding." And just like that, the whole table turned. The conversation moved on. Like I hadn't spoken at all. Like the sound of my voice had simply failed to register in the air. I said I wasn't finished. My mother gave me that smile. The tight one. The one that looked warm to everyone else at the table but landed on me like a door closing. She said, "We're all very proud of you, Claire. Now, Vanessa." And that was it. That was the whole thing. I wasn't asking for permission to be proud of myself. I could do that on my own. I'd been doing it on my own for years. I was asking just once to be heard, to have the sound of my own good news land somewhere before it got swept off the table with the dishes. I never got that. Not in that house. Not once. But there was one place I did. Every Sunday afternoon for most of my life, I took the train out to my grandmother's house. Rosalind, my mother's mother. And the two of them could not have been more different if they'd been strangers. My grandmother's kitchen always smelled of black tea gone cold. She'd pour a cup, set it down, and then forget all about it every single time because she'd get to talking and lose track. So there were always these half-drunk cups of cold tea scattered around her house like little monuments to conversations that had run long. To this day, I can't smell cold tea without feeling my shoulders come down from around my ears. And she had this habit. Whenever she was about to say something that actually mattered, something she wanted me to really hear, she'd tap the table twice with 2 fingers. Tap, tap. Like she was knocking to make sure I was home. And then she'd say it. She was the only person in my life who asked me a question and then actually waited for the answer. Do you understand how rare that is? Most people ask you something, and you can see them already loading up the next thing they want to say. My grandmother asked, and then she went quiet, and she waited, and she let the silence sit there until I filled it. She made me feel like the things inside my head were worth waiting for. One afternoon, I remember she reached across the table and tapped it twice. Tap, tap. And she looked at me and she said, "You see what the loud ones, Miss Claire? You always have. One day that's going to matter more than all of their noise put together." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. I thought it was just something a grandmother says. She left me something before she died. Something the rest of that family would have burned to the ground if they'd ever known it existed. But I'll get to that. She taught me gin rummy, my grandmother. Not the polite version. The real version for real money, nickels and dimes sliding back and forth across her kitchen table on Sunday afternoons. And she did not let me win. Not once, not ever, not even when I was small enough that a loss would put a wobble in my lip. She'd take my last dime and slide it over to her side and say, "The world won't let you win because you're sad, so I won't either." The last game we ever played, I finally beat her. Cleaned her out. $17 in coins and crumpled bills. She looked down at the pile on my side of the table, and then she looked up at me and she said 2 words. "About time." I still have that $17. I never spent it. I don't think I ever will. Rosalind died 2 years ago. In her sleep. Peaceful, the doctor said. Though I've never understood how anyone claims to know that. At the funeral, I sat in the back row. Nobody had saved me a seat up front, and I hadn't expected them to, so it didn't sting the way it might have. What stung was watching my sister Vanessa stand up at that podium and deliver a beautiful, polished eulogy about a remarkable woman who devoted her entire life to her family. I sat in that back row, and I listened to my sister describe a grandmother she'd visited maybe twice a year. A woman whose cold tea she'd never smelled, whose table she'd never learned to tap. Vanessa talked about Sunday dinners she was never at, and advice she was never given, and a bond that had never once existed, and the whole room nodded and dabbed at their eyes because Vanessa was lovely, and Vanessa was convincing, and Vanessa had always known exactly what a room wanted to hear. And sitting there in the back, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost cold. In this family, even grief was just one more thing they would redistribute without asking me. Even my own grandmother, the one person who was mine, they would stand up and claim in front of a crowd. And I would sit in the back and watch it happen the way I'd watched everything happen from the edge of a family that had never quite found room for me at the center of the frame. It started fast after that. Faster than the body was even in the ground, it sometimes felt like. Within weeks, my mother and Vanessa were deciding things. The house, the accounts, what went where, and to whom. I found out secondhand that there had already been a meeting about the estate. A real meeting with numbers and papers. I hadn't been invited to it. Nobody had even thought to mention it was happening. So I called my mother. And I said, "You had a meeting about Grandma's estate and you didn't tell me." And she said, "Oh, Claire. It was just logistics. Boring paperwork. Honestly, you'd have been miserable. It's better to let the people who actually understand these things handle them. There was really no reason to drag you all the way out here for that." I said she was my grandmother too. And there was a pause on the line. A little pause. And then my mother said, "Of course she was, dear," in the exact tone you'd use to agree with a child about something you both know isn't true. That was the moment. That was the moment I stopped being sad about my grandmother and started paying very close attention. The official readings of the estate was set for the end of the month. My mother had her lawyer. Vanessa had her plan, whatever it was. They already knew, all of them, exactly what they wanted to walk away with. What none of them knew was that so did I. Let me stop here for just a second and talk to you directly. If you've ever been the child whose news arrived at the wrong time, the one they talked about instead of two, the one who learned somewhere along the way to make yourself small at the dinner table so you wouldn't be a bother, then I think you already understand exactly what I'm describing in a way that people from warm families never quite will. And I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever found out what your family really says about you when they think you're not in the room? Because 2 weeks after that funeral, I found out exactly that, word for word. And it started with a phone that buzzed at 11:47 at night. 11:47. I remember the exact time because it was sitting right there on the screen when my phone buzzed against the nightstand. One short vibration in a dark, quiet room. I almost didn't look. There was a chat on my phone I hadn't thought about in years. It was called Family with a little heart emoji next to it. I'd muted it so long ago, I'd genuinely forgotten it was still sitting there. Somewhere over the years, I had stopped being part of that family in every way that actually counted, and the chat had just gone silent in my pocket. Dead weight. I assumed everyone had drifted off it years ago the way people do. That night in the dark it lit up, and the very first message I read, the first one in years, was from my sister. "Don't worry about Claire," it said. "She won't understand the legal stuff anyway. Just let Mom handle the paperwork and she'll sign whatever we put in front of her." I sat up in the dark. Because a message like that is not meant for the person it's about, obviously. Nobody sends that to the face of the person they're describing. It was meant for the others. It was said in a room I wasn't supposed to be standing in. They didn't know I was still in the chat, so I scrolled up. And I want you to understand something. I didn't scroll for a minute. I scrolled for 2 hours, sitting up in my bed, the blue light of the screen the only light in the room. Because it turned out this chat wasn't dead at all. It had never been dead. They'd been using it casually, constantly, easily for years. Chatting, planning, laughing. All of them so completely certain that I was gone from it that they never once thought to look. And I read things about myself that a person is simply never meant to read. Claire being difficult, one of them said. Shocking. Did she really think she was getting invited to that? My sister wrote, followed by a little laughing emoji, the kind you send when something is just so obviously beneath you. And then my mother. My mother wrote, "Don't worry about hurting Claire's feelings. She's used to it. She's used to it." You want to know the worst part? The part that actually took the air out of me sitting there in the dark? She was right. I was used to it. That was the entire problem. That was 20 years of my life summed up in 4 words by the woman who'd caused it. And she was right, and she didn't even think it was cruel. She thought it was just a fact. Water is wet. The sky is blue. Claire's used to it. Pass the information along and move on. Now here is where most people expect this story to turn. This is the part where you expect me to type something. To finally snap. To throw a message into that chat with shaking hands. I can see all of this. I've been here the whole time. How dare you? I didn't do that. I did something worse. I opened a folder on my phone, a new empty folder, and I started to take screenshots. Every message, every insult, every plan, every laughing emoji at my expense. I saved all of it, time-stamped, dated, organized, and then I closed the phone and I set it on the nightstand and I lay back down in the dark. And I did not sleep, but I was not crying either. I wasn't going to fight them. I was going to let them keep talking. They thought my silence meant I hadn't noticed. My silence just meant I was taking notes. I want you to do something right now. I'm serious. Look at your phone. Look at the group chats you're in. Not the active ones, the old ones. The ones that went quiet a long time ago. The ones you muted and forgot were even there. Are you sure everyone in those chats is supposed to be there? Are you completely sure that someone somewhere isn't reading quietly the exact way I was reading? Because what I read over the next 3 years changed my life forever. For 3 years, I let them write the case against themselves, one message at a time. They just never once realized they were doing it. While they were talking about me, I was building something. Quietly, the way I did everything. Over those years, I worked my way up in my field, the slow, unglamorous way, the way nobody frames a letter for. I became the person people called when things got complicated and the easy answers had run out. I got my own place. I built my own money carefully from nothing. And I never once asked that family for a single dollar, and I never would, because the only thing worse than their contempt would have been their help with all the strings they'd have tied to it. And every single day I opened that chat and I read. It became a strange sort of ritual, morning coffee and the freshest evidence of what my family actually thought of me. You'd imagine that would break a person's heart a little more each day. And at first it did, but after a while it stopped hurting and started doing something else. It made me still. It made me focused. It was like standing in the exact center of a storm in that one calm spot where nothing can touch you, watching the whole thing spin around you while you stay perfectly coldly dry. And then, about a year into it, the messages changed. They stopped being just casual cruelty. They turned into an actual plan. Once we get the house sorted out, my sister wrote one evening, "Vanessa and Derek can move in. It's really the right thing to do. She'll actually raise a family there, give it some life." And my mother wrote back, "Claire doesn't need it. She's got her little career. We just need to make sure she signs the waiver and doesn't make a fuss about it." The house. My grandmother's house. The kitchen that still smelled of cold tea. They were sitting there in that chat, dividing it up between them, deciding who deserved it and who didn't, arranging the furniture of a life they were going to hand to my sister. They were dividing something that was already mine. But I'll get to that. And then one night, something happened that I will remember for the rest of my life. I was reading the way I always did, lying in the dark, thumb moving slowly up the screen, and a new message appeared right there at the bottom. From Vanessa. "Wait," it said. "Is Claire still in this chat?" My thumb froze over the glass. I stopped breathing. I mean that literally. I lay there in the dark and I did not take a breath. And then 3 little dots appeared at the bottom of the screen. Somebody was typing. Somebody was about to say something. And then the dots vanished. And then a moment later they came back. Somebody was typing again. For about 10 seconds, 3 years of careful silence very nearly came apart in my hands, right there in the dark. And then my mother answered. "She muted this thing years ago," my mother wrote. "That account's dead. Stop worrying about it. That account's dead. She called me dead. Right there in writing, she looked at the possibility of me and she waved it away as a dead account, a thing not worth the 10 seconds it would have taken to check. They almost saw me. For 10 seconds, they almost found me sitting there in the dark, and then they decided I wasn't worth checking. That was their last mistake. Around that same time, I had coffee with my Uncle Marcus, my mother's younger brother, and the other person that family had quietly written off over the years. Too much of an artist, they always said. Not enough of a lawyer. Never quite serious enough for the Bennetts and their brass plaques. We didn't talk about the chat. I didn't breathe a word of it to him. But near the end of that coffee, out of nowhere, he set down his cup and looked at me for a long moment, and he said, "Your grandmother trusted you for a reason, kid." More than one reason. I asked him what he meant by that. And he just smiled a small, sad smile, and he said, "You'll see." I filed that away in the back of my mind. I didn't know it yet, but my Uncle Marcus was holding the very last piece of this whole thing. Now, that thing my grandmother left me, it's finally time I told you what it was. It wasn't money. Rosalind was never sentimental about money. Money, she used to say, is just a way of keeping score, and she'd stopped caring about the score a long time ago. It was a document, a trust. Set up quietly, years before she died, through a lawyer that no one in my family had ever heard of or ever met. And inside that trust, my grandmother had left me the house. Not a share of it. Not a vote in what happened to it. Not a sentimental keepsake from it. The house, deeded cleanly and completely through that trust to me, with one single written instruction attached, that no one else in the family was to be told it existed until the day the estate was read aloud. She knew. Somehow, from wherever she sat in those final years, watching that family the way she watched everything, she knew exactly what they would try to do the moment she was gone. And so before she died, she made sure that the one thing they wanted most in the world already had my name carved quietly into the middle of it. They spent 3 years planning how to take a house. It had my name on it the entire time. If you want to see what happened when I finally walked into that room, then stay with me. Because what I found inside my grandmother's trust wasn't just the house. There was a second clause, a quiet one near the end. And that clause is the entire reason this story does not end the way any single person at that table expected it to. You think you know where this is going? You don't. Not yet. The reading was held at my mother's house. Of course it was. Home field. Her table, her lawyer, her rules. 12 chairs arranged around that long dining table. The whole house smelling of lemon furniture polish on wood older than any person in the room. My mother had hired a real lawyer in a real suit and seated him at the head of the table like a referee brought in to officiate a game she had already decided she'd won. I walked in 2 minutes late, on purpose. I wanted to see the room before the room saw me. My mother sat at the head, of course, poised, composed, already holding court. Vanessa beside her phone, face down on the table, a slim folder squared up neatly in front of her. My aunt with her coffee. A scattering of cousins. My father tucked into the corner, quiet, the way he had been quiet my entire life, a man who had learned long ago that agreeing with my mother was simply cheaper than the alternative. And there, near the door to the kitchen, the service door, was one empty chair. For me, naturally. Not at the table so much as near it. I sat down in it, and I said nothing at all. The lawyer began to read. The small things first, the way they always do it. Accounts, a few specific bequests, a piece of jewelry here, a sum of money there. And then my mother took over. Because of course she did. She was never going to let a stranger in a suit narrate the most important part. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she smiled around the room, warm and reasonable, and she said now. About the house. I think we're all in agreement that it makes the most sense for the house to go to Vanessa and Derek. They're starting a family. They'll fill it with children. They'll take proper care of it. They'll keep it in the family the way Mother would have wanted. Claire has her own life, her own little career out there. She doesn't need to be tied down to an old house. So we've had a simple waiver drawn up for Claire to sign, and once that's done, we can all move forward together as a family. And the room nodded, gently, warmly, reasonably, as though this were a kindness being done to me, as though they were solving a problem on my behalf. And here is what not a single person at that table knew. While my mother was talking in that warm, reasonable voice, I was thinking about the second clause, The quiet one, near the end of my grandmother's trust. The one I had read 3 separate times alone just to be certain I understood it correctly. A no contest clause. In plain language stripped of all the legal armor around it, it said this: that anyone who tried to challenge the trust or manipulate it or scheme in any way to take the house away from the person it had been left to would automatically forfeit everything else they were owed from the entire estate. Every account, every dollar, every bequest, gone. The moment they reached for what wasn't theirs. My grandmother hadn't just protected the house. She had built a trap around it. A beautiful, silent, patient trap. And the trap only ever sprang shut on a person who reached in to take what they had no right to take. They were building a case right there in front of me to take my house. They had no idea they were also in the very same breath building the case to lose absolutely everything else. And then Vanessa slid the waiver across the table toward me. The paper hissed softly against the wood. She looked at me with those patient, practiced, lovely eyes. And she said, "You're in finance, Claire. You of all people don't need some drafty old house. Let your little sister start a family here. Just be generous for once in your life. Don't be selfish." And my mother softly, warmly pitching it so the whole table could hear every word added. "Your grandmother would want it to go to someone who'll actually use it, dear. Please, don't make this ugly. Just sign it." And the room nodded along one more time. 12 people quietly agreeing that I was the difficult one, the selfish one. The ungrateful daughter, making things ugly, refusing to simply sign away a house she'd been generously offered the chance to give up. A house that, unknown to every single one of them, was already legally, completely mine. And I felt something go very, very calm inside me. It was the calm my grandmother used to have. The stillness that came over her right before she reached out and tapped that table twice. I looked across at my sister. And I said very quietly, "You're right. Grandma did want it to go to someone specific." Vanessa smiled. She actually smiled. She thought I was agreeing with her. She thought she'd won. She uncapped the pen and held it out to me across the table. My mother smiled. The lawyer straightened his stack of papers, getting ready to notarize. And every single person in that room leaned in slightly and waited for the selfish one, the practical one, the beige one, to finally sign her own house away. I did not take the pen. I reached into my bag, and I took out my phone. I set my phone face up on the table, right in the center of it, next to the waiver, next to the pen that no one was holding anymore. Vanessa's smile flickered, just barely. The way a candle flame bends when a door opens somewhere far off in the house before anyone's even felt the draft. And I said, "You thought you were talking behind my back." And then I let a little silence open up in the room. You were just recording the evidence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking, and I'd never noticed it before that moment, and I've never forgotten it since. My mother's face did something I had never once seen it do in 30 years. It went still. Not calm. Caught. The composure just slid off of it all at once like a sheet pulled off a piece of furniture. And then I began to read. I read the first one out loud into that silent waiting room. "Don't worry about Claire. She won't understand the legal stuff anyway. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her." I looked up. I looked directly at my sister. "You wrote that one," I said, 6 weeks ago, a Tuesday." And I kept reading. Claire being difficult again is shocking. Did she really think she was getting invited to that? The room had gone into that specific, total kind of silence that only ever happens when a group of people realize all at the same moment that the floor is no longer where they left it, that they are standing on nothing, that they have been standing on nothing for some time. And then I read the one I had been carrying inside me for 3 years. I read it slowly. I read it carefully. I wanted my mother to hear every single word of it in her own voice, spoken aloud in her own dining room. "Don't worry about hurting Claire's feelings. She's used to it." I set the phone down flat on the table, and I looked at her and I said, "You're right, Mom. I was used to it. That's the only reason you got away with it for as long as you did. I want to tell you what that room looked like." My aunt had frozen completely. Her coffee cup stopped halfway between the table and her mouth held there in the air like a photograph of a woman drinking coffee. My father had fixed his eyes down on the grain of the table, and in that moment, I understood with a strange lack of anger that he had always known. All of it. My entire life. He had simply decided every single day that it was easier to study the wood grain than it was to look at me. And Vanessa reached for my phone. I moved it out of her reach, slowly, without a word. Just slid it a few inches across the table out past her fingers. And she froze there, with her hand hanging in the empty air in front of the entire family, caught in the act of reaching for the evidence of everything she'd done. And then I said, "There's one more I want to read. This one's my favorite. I found it. And I read it." "Wait, is Claire still in this chat?" I looked up at my sister. "That one was you," I said. 8 months ago. For about 10 seconds, you almost figured it out. You almost checked. You were so close. And then I read my mother's reply in my mother's voice into my mother's silent house. She muted this thing years ago. That account's dead. Stop worrying about it. I let that one sit in the air for a long moment. "Dead," I said finally. "You called me dead." And then you kept right on talking. For 8 more months, you had exactly one chance to stop and check whether I was standing in the room, and you decided I wasn't worth the 10 seconds. My mother found her voice at last, and it came out the way it always came out when she'd lost control of a room and needed to seize it back. Sharp, hard, wounded somehow, as though she were the injured party. "This is a violation," she said. "You've been spying on this family. Sitting there in silence, reading our private conversations. What kind of a sick person does that, Claire? What kind of a daughter?" I let her finish. I always let the other person finish. It makes what comes next land so much harder when they've fully emptied the chamber first. And then I said I didn't spy on anyone. You put me in that chat. You kept me in it because you were so completely sure I didn't matter that you never once bothered to look. Every word on this phone you wrote, to each other. On purpose. I didn't say a single thing. That was the whole point. For 3 years, the only person in that chat who never said a cruel word was me. And then I turned in my chair and I looked at the lawyer in the good suit, the one my mother had hired and paid for, and I said, "You should probably hear this next part too. It affects your paperwork." And I told them about the trust. I told them that the house had been deeded to me quietly through a trust years before Rosalind ever died. That it had never once been part of the estate they thought they were carving up. That it had never been theirs to give to anyone. That every plan they had made in that chat, every arrangement, every moving of furniture, had been a plan to hand my sister something that already legally, completely had my name on it. Vanessa said, That's not possible. The house is part of the estate. It has to be part of the estate. It was never part of the estate, I said. Grandma made absolutely certain of that. Because she knew you'd try. And then I gave them the last piece. The one that even the lawyer's face changed at, the one that made the man in the good suit slowly set down his pen. "There's a no contest clause in the trust," I said. Grandma wrote it herself, and what it says is this: that anyone who tries to manipulate or challenge or scheme to take the house away from the person she left it to forfeits everything else they were owed out of her estate. All of it. Automatically. I looked slowly around that table. At the folder in front of Vanessa. At the waiver sitting there with its uncapped pen. At the lawyer my mother had hired specifically to make all of this clean and official and permanent. "You didn't just fail to take the house," I said. "You spent 3 years documenting in writing in perfect detail exactly the kind of scheme that clause was written to punish. And then you spent this entire meeting triggering it. On the record, out loud, in front of the lawyer that you hired, you spent 3 years deciding what I deserved. Grandma already decided what you'd get if you tried. Read Clause 9. My mother stood up. Her chair scraped hard and ugly against the floor. "After everything this family has done for you," she started. "What did this family do for me?" I asked. And I wasn't shouting. I asked it quietly, almost gently, because I genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Name one thing. Just one. I'll wait. And she couldn't. She stood there at the head of her own table, her mouth slightly open, reaching back through 30 years for a single moment of it, and coming up with nothing because there was nothing there to find. And when a person like my mother reaches for the history and finds it empty, they always reach for the same last weapon. the oldest one they own. "You are being cruel," she said, her voice climbing. "You are tearing this entire family apart out of pure spite. Your grandmother would be ashamed of you." Ashamed. And there it was, the final card in her hand. Guilt. I looked at her for a moment, and I waited to feel it. The pull of it. The old familiar tug that had kept me small and quiet and used to it for 30 years. And it just wasn't there anymore. Instead, I felt something very old and very heavy finally gently setting itself down on the ground after a long, long time of carrying it. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. "I stopped needing to hurt you a long time ago. That's the part you never understood. I'm just done pretending I didn't hear you. And I didn't write those messages, Mom. You did." I picked up my phone. I slid it back into my bag. I stood up, and my chair scraped once against that old floor. And it was the only sound in the entire room. 12 people at that table, and not one of them said my name as I walked to the door. For 30 years, some small, stupid, hopeful part of me had been waiting for exactly that. For one of them to call me back. To say, "Wait," to say, "Claire, stop, come sit at the table, we see you. We always saw you." And walking to that door, I finally understood that I didn't need them to anymore. That I hadn't needed it for a while. That the waiting itself had been the last thing holding me in that house. I opened the door. I stepped through it. And I closed it behind me. I didn't slam it. People who are finally free don't need to. If you're still here with me all this way, and then thank you. Truly. This wasn't an easy thing to say out loud, and knowing that someone's actually listening, that I'm not just talking into the dark the way I did for 3 years, it means more than I can really explain. If any part of this is landing with you, take a second to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. But the story doesn't end in that room. Because 1 week later my phone rang, and it was my Uncle Marcus. And he told me something that finally explained why my grandmother wrote that clause in the first place. Let me tell you about that call. The fallout was quiet at first, and then all at once it wasn't. The house was mine, legally, cleanly, completely beyond any possibility of challenge. My mother's own lawyer confirmed it within the week, and I have to imagine that was an uncomfortable invoice for him to write out and send to her. But it was the no contest clause that truly did the work. Because my grandmother's estate, all the accounts and the investments and the sums my mother and my sister had been so absolutely certain of all of it, had been meant to be divided among the family. And by triggering that clause in writing on the record in front of a lawyer, my mother and Vanessa forfeited their shares of every last bit of it. All of it. It passed instead to the rest of the family, and a portion of it by the terms my grandmother had written to me. They didn't lose the house. They lost the house and everything else, reaching for the one thing that was never theirs to begin with. And the story spread. Not from me. I never said a single word to anyone. It spread because 12 people had been in that room, and stories like that one do not stay in rooms. They walk out the door on 12 different sets of feet, and they go everywhere. Vanessa, who had built her entire self, her whole golden identity on being the perfect daughter, the lovely one, the one in all the frames, spent that season quietly explaining to relative after relative why exactly her own grandmother had written a legal clause specifically to protect her older sister from her. I didn't feel triumphant hearing all of it. I want to be honest with you about that because I think you'd know if I were lying. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt tired. I felt the specific bone-deep tiredness of a person who has finally set down a weight she carried for so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her own body. My grandmother had been right about it in the end. Sometimes the truth is punishment enough. I didn't have to do a single thing to them. They had done all of it to themselves 3 years, and one message at a time in a chat they were certain I couldn't see. Now. That phone call from my Uncle Marcus. He said, "Kid, I heard what happened. The whole family's heard by now." And then he went quiet for a second, and he said, "There's something you should know. Something I probably should have told you a long time ago." I sat down. "Your grandmother didn't write that clause on a hunch," he said. "She didn't just have a bad feeling. She wrote it because she caught them. Years ago. Vanessa forged a document once a small thing, an account transfer, tried to move something that wasn't hers while your grandmother was still alive to notice. And Rosalind caught it. She never made a scene about it. She never told a soul. But she never forgot it either, not for one day. That's when she set up the trust for you, Marcus said. That's the exact moment she wrote Clause 9. She'd figured out what kind of people they were, and she knew she couldn't change it, couldn't fix them, couldn't make them love you the way they should have. But she could do one thing. She could make sure that on the day they finally came for you, the trap was already set and waiting. I asked him why. Why me? Why the house? Why go to all that trouble, all that quiet patient planning for the granddaughter everyone else had written off, and my Uncle Marcus said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Because you were the only one who ever actually listened to her? He said. She used to tell me that every time I saw her near the end. Claire listens, she'd say. Claire actually listens. Turns out, kid, that was worth more to her than the whole house put together. I live in her house now. The kitchen still smells very faintly of black tea. I honestly don't know how. Maybe it soaked into the walls after all those years. Maybe I only imagine it because I want to. But some afternoons I make myself a cup and I let it sit too long on purpose until it goes cold exactly the way she always did, and the whole house smells like Sunday. And when I have something I need to think all the way through, I catch myself doing it without deciding to. 2 fingers on the tabletop, tap tap, knocking to see if anyone's home. The $17 I won off of her is framed now. It hangs in that kitchen by the window where the afternoon light comes in. Anyone else who saw it would think it was the strangest thing in the world, a few old coins and some crumpled bills in a frame on a wall. I know exactly what it's worth. My father called me once a few months after all of it. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. And there was a long silence on the line, the kind he'd hidden behind my whole life. And then he said, I should have said something. All those years, I should have said something, Claire. And I waited, holding the phone, to see if the rest of it was coming, the part where he actually did say something, even now, even this late. But that was all there was. I should have said something. Not, I'm sorry. Not I was wrong. Just an observation about his own silence offered up like it was the same thing as breaking it. I told him I appreciated the call. And I meant it in a small way. And then I told him I had to go. And I did have to go. I had tea on the stove. That's the thing nobody tells you about walking away from people. It isn't loud. It isn't a scene. It's mostly just a series of quiet phone calls that you let go a little shorter each time, until one day you realize the distance is simply there, settled in, permanent, and you didn't have to fight for it after all. You just had to stop reaching across it. I don't hate them. That's the part people always find hardest to believe when I tell them this. But hate takes energy, and hate keeps you tied to a person just as tightly as love does. I spent 30 years tied to that family, by the hope that they'd finally turn around and see me. I wasn't about to spend the next 30 tied to them by hate instead. I'd rather spend that energy on the tea and the house and the light coming through the kitchen window in the afternoon. So here's what I learned. If you've stayed with me this long, if you want the one thing I took out of all of it, then here it is. Being underestimated is not a wound. It's a vantage point. People will talk freely, carelessly, honestly in front of someone they've decided not to see. They will show you exactly who they are, right down to the bone, if you can only manage to stay quiet enough and still enough and steady enough to let them do it. I spent 30 years believing my silence meant that I was small, that being unseen meant I was worth less. It didn't. It never did. My silence turned out to be the one thing they never thought to account for. The one card they never saw in my hand, because they never once believed I was holding any cards at all. Your worth was never up for their vote. It never was. Not for one single day of your life. And the fact that they couldn't see it says everything about them and absolutely nothing about you. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 30 years old. And I finally stopped waiting for a family that forgot me to remember that I was there. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you at all, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. And remember this, they forgot to remove me from the chat. And I will never ever forget what it taught me. Sometimes the people who refuse to see you will tell you exactly who they are, if you're just quiet enough to listen.